Oh, we got a lot of people signing in today.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, we're nearing about 85 people, but as you all know, I like to start on time. So we're going to get into it. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I'm Deacon Vicki Hanrahan, and I'm the Assistant to Bishop for Synodical Life for the South Central Synod of Wisconsin. I want to thank you for joining us today for an Equipping the Saints webinar. That is our weekly connection with Bishop Rogness and with each other as we walk together in this part of God's kingdom, the South Central Synod of Wisconsin. Today we are joined by a special guest, the Reverend Dr. Everett Mitchell, and Bishop Rogness will introduce him in a moment and our topic at hand. A note that we are recording this webinar. So if you were, for people who were unable to make it today, you can also listen to it. If there's something that you missed this part of the webinar, then you can go ahead and go to our health resources page on the Synod website. But first, let's open with a moment of silent prayer and a remembrance of those who have lost their lives to oppression, to racism, to violence, to marginalization. George Floyd is a representation of many who have gone before him and will go after him, including innocent children who are literally getting caught in the crossfire. Let us pray for the safety of our people, the healing of our brokenness, and the resolution of all things that bring people farther away from God's purpose for us. You are invited now to pray your own silent prayer for all who are suffering this day. We lift these prayers to you, O Lord, and ask that you give us the strength to not just pray, but to stand up and effect change. Bless our conversation today and help us to consider each other's comments with kindness, understanding, and good intention. We ask this through your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Bishop Rogness, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Vicki. Thanks for setting it all up and getting us started, as you have done so well. Most of all of you are aware, and I've explained to Pastor Mitchell, that these weekly Zoom conversations among pastors and other leaders in our synods actually started a couple months ago when we entered a time of COVID had separated us from our worshiping congregations, and we were beginning to ask questions about how do we regather and what decisions do we make? So that was the focus for a while until, of course, May 25th. And then, while we have continued to talk some about those questions of regathering, we also have spent time with a second strain of conversation, and that is how do we lead our congregations in this time as congregational leaders, in a time when front and center in the national consciousness and the national conversation are the issues of race and institutional racism and the patterns of race in society that have been oppressive and unjust to some, and have resulted in however one would describe it, a racially unbalanced society. And a number of you have begun to have some of those conversations in your congregations and have met with a variety of responses. And as we've talked about that, one name that came in my brief experience these months in South Central Synod of Wisconsin has been that I've heard repeatedly was Everett Mitchell, who has served the Madison community in two ways, both as a pastor of Solid Rock, Christ the Solid Rock Baptist Church in Madison, and as a Dane County judge. By way of introduction, I did a little looking at the biographical information on this fellow, and frankly, we could take all day. I could use most of the hour simply introducing him. Here's the short version. He was born and raised in Texas, in the South. He went to Atlanta to attend Morehouse College, where he began to receive a whole list of awards as an undergrad and a graduate. Went on to Princeton Seminary, where he got not one, but two graduate degrees, a Master of Divinity and a Master of Theology, both in the field of ethics. And as though that isn't enough, then he came to Madison, to the University of Madison, University of Wisconsin Law School in Madison, and graduated with a law degree as well. So since, for nearly 10 years, since 2011, he's been the senior pastor at Christ the Solid Rock Baptist Church, and since 2016 has served as a judge, circuit judge in Dane County. So he gets not only spread thin, but is widely sought as someone who speaks and understands well our context, our Wisconsin context, our church context, our societal context. And it was clear to me that in terms of our moving our own conversation along, well, I think it's, on the one hand, it's very much our responsibility as mostly white leaders of a mostly white denomination to not be asking others to carry the responsibility for fixing what's wrong with us. On the other hand, a part of what we do to address our context in a healthy way is to listen and to understand perspectives on the part of that are coming from people other than ourselves in our midst. So that was the background. That was the genesis of my seeking his openness to being part of this conversation, which he's been very open to participating in. I told him I would invite some questions from people within our synod, which I did last week, and we did through email, and a number of you send in a variety of questions. We probably won't get to all of them, and what's more, I don't want this conversation to simply be my reading a set of questions. I want it to be more interactive, which leads me to ask you, as the conversation unfolds and we seek to have it be participatory, back and forth, use the chat room. If you have questions to pose, put them in the chat room. We'll spot them and ask them, perhaps unmute you if there are follow-up questions to be raised, so that this becomes a kind of a back and forth dialogue. So with all of that by way of introduction, let me start off posing the question this way, which kind of undergirds much of it. So, as I mentioned, the ELCA nationally, as well as in our area, is a predominantly white denomination. We are, some have observed, the whitest of the major denominations in this country. That's also true in the South Central Synod of Wisconsin. For years, I did a little digging prior to our town hall meetings a few months ago. For years, since the advent of the ELCA, the non-white population in the congregations of this synod hovered between 1% and 2%. 10 years ago, in 2018, it was 6%, which means that even though that's a pretty small percentage, it does mean that we are on the cusp of becoming a more diverse church than we have been historically. But most of you who are watching this are in congregations that are largely or entirely white. And as you represent our life as a church body, where together nationally we make statements calling on ourselves to confess the sin of racism and the sins of white supremacy. I know that a number of you in our congregations are meeting up with people whose response is, that's those people. Other people are racist. We're very welcoming of a good number of people. I think it'd be interesting to begin this conversation by simply posing for Pastor Mitchell some reflections on how might a predominantly white denomination such as we are in this part of the country, in south central Wisconsin, begin to equip our people for the kind of deeper conversations that we need to be having in our congregations and in our society more broadly. So I've talked a whole bunch in terms of sort of setting the table. Pastor Mitchell, let me invite you to respond to what you've been thinking about as I not only pose this question, but as you've been thinking about entering into this conversation with these folks.
All right, first, thank you. Thank you, Peter, for allowing me to be in this conversation, man. I really appreciate you reaching out and the courageous ways in which you allowed me to be able to join in and support, my colleagues in ministry. I will say that as a part that you didn't read was that I was a member of Lake Edge Lutheran Church for 4 years. I served with them when they had their pastoral leadership team there. Started teaching Bible study there at Lake Edge. I see Mary Graper's on this call, so shout out to Mary Graper, who also attends Lake Edge. And she's been a member of my Bible studies for almost the last decade. As I've started teaching the book of Mark and have, moved through basically the entire Bible in those 8 to 10 years that we've been together. So I started at Lake Edge, served there and worked with their pastoral leadership team and in many different capacities, and have tried to maintain a collaborative relationship with Lake Edge as the senior pastor of Christ at Solid Rock. So we have done we used to do joint Bible studies together. We've done joint men's ministry, joint women's ministry, joint Vocation Bible School. And we've learned a lot about the differences in the context of congregational life and how the perceptions of community members can both can accelerate the beauty of community, but it also can undermine the trust that is so fragile within the lives of communities of color and those communities, those Lutheran congregations that are seeking to be in that space. So I just wanted to kind of lay that foundation so you know that I'm not just a Baptist coming into this conversation with some Lutherans, but that I have had a significant relationship with Lutheran pastors over the years, and have tried to make sure that my congregation is one that lives out the motto of being engaging. We could choose to just be a Black congregation focused on our Black brothers and sisters and our community and our context, but I have challenged the congregation to be uncomfortable and be in uncomfortable spaces. And they have begrudgingly at times followed me into these spaces, but I think we are the better because of it. When we talk about the struggles that some of our Lutheran brothers and sisters have that make it somewhat difficult, and if I'm being transparent, I think some of the honest struggles that we have is hierarchical leadership that sometimes may not always reflect what pastors are seeing on the ground. So I've been in situations where you've had switching of bishops of organizations, the hierarchical nature of whether or not it's an imperative, and whether or not that imperative is respected within the context of the local congregation. So I've seen a lot of congregations struggle because if it's not important for the national body, how do they fuse that down to the local body and then try to communicate that? So there has to be, on a national level, there has to be some consistency around their commitment to helping congregation and pastors to, whether it is a seminary, whether it is through the trainings that are required for Lutheran pastors to undergo to stay connected, whether it is the fellowship opportunities. There has to be a national commitment to that conversation. And what is the conversation I think pastors need to have? One, I always go back to seminary because I think most pastors, whether you recently went through seminary or I see some of y'all probably went to seminary 75 years ago, it looks like. So whether regardless of when it is you went there, there's not always this training that allows for people to have a lens to go into a space where they are able to have a coherent conversation with a Black congregation about theology or life in general. I mean, a lot of the pastors are so uncomfortable, and unnecessarily so, because all we're trying to do is really build up a way for us to have relationship together. So the one thing that starts the conversation and makes it so difficult is because many of the congregational leaders, uh, and you are a congregational based institution, so you depend heavily on your committees and your committees that drive mission, and they drive the mission, and they are the ones who really give the leadership of the congregation, and not always the pastors who do that. So you really have to spend a lot of time investing in the congregational leadership spaces to ensure that the leaders that you have chairing the committees that deal with missions, or the chairs of the committees that deal with congregational mission or pastoral leadership or pastoral care, that they have the lenses that are necessary. So while I understand that the kind of pastoral role is a little different than a Black church, it still is centered in a belief that the individuals that are in the pews are the ones that are propelling the purpose of the congregation and the life of the church. So you have to spend time doing that. But in order to do that, I think pastors have to take on a different role as educators, and not necessarily educators from the pulpit, because I think that delegitimizes the work of a pastor, right? I don't think every Sunday you need to get up and preach a sermon about race, but it does mean that in the spaces where you're not preaching, you have to occupy that space so that they understand that you're bringing a level of education to them. So how do you talk about race? How do you talk about racism? And I think people are very uncomfortable, because the moment that you say, let's talk about race, they hear you calling them a racist. And there's a difference between being influenced by, the ideas of white supremacy and being a racist. And there are a lot of my white allies who grow up not knowing or not having people of color in their spheres, and I would never call them a racist. I would say that they sometimes are blinded by the influence of whiteness and what that means in our culture, but they're so far away from being a racist. They are some of the kindest and loving. I got a shout out to one of the most wonderful people, wonderful couple, Audrey and Luther Simonson. I mean, these old white folks is, you know what I'm saying? He stood tall. Luther stood tall. Audrey stood tall. When I had conflicts in their congregational spaces, they may not have had Black art in their house or adopted Black children, but they were the kind of human beings that Christ wanted us all to be. They saw color, but they saw purpose too, right? So I wanted to make sure that you understand that there are examples in the Lutheran spaces that have done this well. Mary Kay Baum, another mentor of mine, was a great mentor to me. She hired me at Madison Area Urban Ministry. She was a Lutheran pastor, and her heart was there. So I could just name off the others that have been so important to me in this journey that I think could do it. But to go back to the idea, what did they see about race? They saw race as a historical narrative that was not true. So if pastors are trying to educate themselves around race, I would say a wonderful documentary that every pastor should have in his or her closet is Race, the Power of an Illusion. It is a PBS documentary, Race, the Power of an Illusion. You can Google it. I even think it's somewhat free on YouTube now. But when I started teaching about race, it was the first thing that really codified what race is, because people think it's about color of skin. It's not about color of skin. Race is not about black, white, yellow, brown. That's not. Race is about the idea of inferiority being attached to color of skin. That is what race is. And the idea that white is superior and black, brown are inferior is race. That is what makes race so differently. The fact that people have different skin colors is not the same thing as focusing on what makes a person racist or not. So once you have that definition of the idea that the race is a construct, and it's really an American construct that was created when Thomas Jefferson penned the famous words in Notes to a Slave of Virginia, when he said, whether it is in body or mind, I find that the black race is inferior to whiteness. And when Thomas Jefferson penned that in the notes of the state of Virginia, that was the first time in our history that anybody had attached inferiority and superiority to the idea of race. And that connection to those two principles is what spurred now what we start talking about when we start thinking about, well, what is racism? What is a systemic racism? And what is the difference? Because now that they pin the idea of inferiority and superiority, then they begin to create policies, whether it was legal, educational systems, whether it was, even religion, right, was used to justify supporting this idea that, white was superior and black was inferior, right? So all white images of Jesus is good. Anything was black was associated with the devil. Just think about it, how we grew up, images of a white, pristine, old white God, white God. Even, what was it, George Burns, the movie back in the day, right? Even media jumped on it and started, sharing ideas of, God being this old white dude who was sitting up, coming down to earth every now and then, giving people high fives and making things work out. Those ideas, continue to plague the ability for people to begin to see anything different. So when white allies or white people were trying to be allies say to me, well, I don't see myself as a racist, I would say to them, it's designed for you not to see yourself as a racist. Mm-hmm. It was designed for you to see yourself as superior. It's designed to see yourself as the one in the hierarchy that makes the decisions. I was just having a discussion with my daughter, and she has a friend of hers that she really likes, and they were having this conversation, and he said to her, well, I believe that in the beginning Adam was a white man and Eve was a black woman. And my daughter thought it was cute, and I said, really? Why does he think that Adam was the white man? And so I said, so he was the first man, everything originated from him. And in her mind, she had thought that the conversation was cute because he included a black woman. I said, so no. Understand what that means when they say that, right? Those kind of hierarchical conversations exist all around us, even into the young generation, because it has been infused itself into their consciousness. So if any pastor is trying to help their congregation, you can't always come from it from like, you should feel bad, you didn't have 4 black friends in your life, so now you're racist. No, that's not it. Racists are the people who choose to maintain the superior definition and the inferior definition binary. That's what makes a person a racist. When they will not let go of that paradigm, then they are racist, because everything that extends from that is going to extend from that kind of racialized binary at the same time. I hope that makes sense to you. So when you think about what makes one racist, they will not let go of that paradigm. And that manifests itself in every aspect of life, so, it may sound, cheap. If you ever participate in a hiring committee and people will say something like, well, I don't quite think they will fit our culture, or I don't know if they will be a good fit for our environment, right? Those are the kinds of conversations that people, when you ask them to explain what that means, it is sometimes because they are trying their best to maintain that binary of what is superior and what is inferior. So I'll stop right there and see if there's a follow-up from those brief remarks, Peter, that you think I should follow up on.
Yeah, I'm interested in your going a little bit further with where you are right now, and that is when you talk about that race isn't directly tied to simply the color of the skin, but rather our problem is in the presumption of superiority of if I'm white and someone else isn't, I am more likely to be able to fit the culture, able to be a good decision maker, able to be whatever, that presumption. How much of that, it seems to me, I'll just own this statement, it seems to me that that kind of racial bias exists on 2 levels. One is conscious, where one is able to look at a person of another race and recognize that I don't think they're going to fit this. I mean, it's the NFL for decades not having a black quarterback, because after all, they can't really do that kind of work. Mm-hmm. But there's also subconscious bias, it seems to me, that operates deep within us by virtue of our having simply been raised and centered most of the time in a society where the European American experience has always been regarded as the ascendant experience, that who's been in power, that's who has shaped the culture that now works the way it does now. Um, and it's simply in the air that we breathe. It's kind of like a coronavirus that you can't see it. It's just in us, and it infects all kinds of ways that we interact with others and make presumptions about others. And so to bring that back to the congregations that we are serving, I think we're just full of people who have never examined this very carefully and including not examined their own subconscious presumptions. The challenge for us is how do we help people get at that?
That's why I think you can't approach it, because if they don't have relationships, you can't approach it from a relational perspective, right? If they're an all-white congregation that they may have adopted some Black kids or Latino kids or some kids from Africa or something like that, and they may have some base of knowledge, but if they don't have a relational way to do it, you got to do it educationally. You got to do it from their head to their heart. And sometimes that works best. That's why I love, doing educational series in Lutheran congregations, because they will read. I mean, I haven't walked into one Lutheran congregation where they will read, they will engage text, they will engage adult learning. And so you have to be intentional about bringing in the right presenters to be able to engage the congregation intellectually. They have to be engaged intellectually. That's why watching the documentary, Race, the Power, and the Illusion together as a community, talking about it from a historical, educational lens, will give them a language to talk about something that is insidious and that is almost, like you say, in the air we breathe. I just don't, in all the years I've been doing this, Peter, I just have not seen a way to get over that hump if you're not trying to give them the educational pathways to do it. And I will say that in the last 7 years, there have been more tools that you can access than there were when I first started this work about 15 years ago. There's just been way more things to use, way more educational tools, way more documentaries that really do open up a dialogue for individuals who are trying to understand this. How do I understand this virus? How do I understand what's in the air I breathe? How do I understand how it has impacted me? How do I understand how it was intentionally meant for me to think this way, to see this way? And I will be honest, Peter, white men have a harder time than white women. Because at least for white women, I can say, you understand sexism, don't you? You understand what it means for a white man or white men to make decisions that you shouldn't be on the board, or you shouldn't be ordained, or you shouldn't pastor, or you shouldn't lead a committee. They understand that sexism. And so you can make that bridge between the sexism to racism, because they're more ingrained emotionally to that. When you're trying to convince older white guys who may see themselves as, not being like that, they will struggle a little bit harder. So you really have to engage them more intellectually and relationally, so they can begin to make that journey. Because in their minds, it's like, I'm giving up power, right? If I subconsciously have seen myself as superior, what does it mean then for me if I'm not that person? If I am not superior, if I am not in the image of Jesus, or if God is not in my image, what does that then mean for who I am and what I am, and what do I look like and where do I find myself? It puts them on a journey that, quite frankly, nobody has been able to quite reconcile for them yet. And so comes with this risk. And I think the risk starts with engaging people on a more intellectual plane until you have the relationships that change the hearts of individuals. I like to think that over the years that I've been teaching Lake Edge Lutheran in my Bible studies and other folks from the other churches, I would like to think that their hearts have always been open, but there was something beautiful about a relationship being built over the Bible, and us committing ourselves to learning that Bible together. Every Thursday, every Wednesday night, we've been there with each other all these years. And that's where I think the church ultimately can go, and we can get to those solutions later.
You spoke early on. You spoke of working with your own congregation in these kinds of conversations and moving from comfortable into uncomfortable conversation. And when you said that, I was thinking of a book that's sort of making the rounds now, and somebody just posted a reference to it in the chat room, White Fragility,
Yes.
which written by a white woman, but saying, making the point that conversations, even among white progressives, whom interestingly she sees as the hardest nut to crack in all of this, being hampered largely by a white belief that we'll enter into these conversations, but for some reason we have a right to be comfortable and not to be pushed beyond that. How do you, maybe you can reflect on your own experience that you made reference to a little bit ago of helping a group move from conversation that is fairly comfortable and non-threatening into arenas that might be a bit more uncomfortable for them?
All of these conversations are going to be very uncomfortable. There's, you know, I think the ways in which, because the nature of conversation is uncomfortable. Now, I'll tell you that missions and giving is comfortable, right? When we start having these conversations, the first thing, you know, church will wonder, where can I give money to, or where can I send stuff, or where can we go, you know, do missions? And I'll say, no, this ain't about missions. I don't want your money. I want you to sit down. Let's talk. Let's talk about what you don't know. Let's talk about what you have not experienced. And I think the book White Fragility, quite honestly, Peter, it's a conversation for Midwest people to have, because y'all know the hardest thing is Midwest nice. Midwest nice is that it's like almost like demonic tool that the enemy has implanted inside of our community, so that Midwest nice people never want to be in conflict, and they see any kind of tension as conflict that they seek to avoid at all costs. That hinders our ability to have a full conversation. And I'll tell you that, it is very difficult to have uncomfortable conversations. I remember, and Mary Graper was there, you know, I've had conflicts with, you know, pastors at Lake Edge just over teaching Bible study. And I've never been, you know, as a Black man trying to build this, you start to realize, like, when you start to engage the community, all of the insecurities of whiteness come out. I mean, I've been betrayed by white pastors in ways I would have never thought was ethical for white pastors to do, to the point that I've almost had to sue congregational leaders, particularly the pastors, for defamation and of character, and have to take them to court, and met with bishops and had to sit down. And I'm like, how is it that you are trying to say we are a just community, but you are doing everything you can to undermine and stab me in the back? And all I'm doing is teaching free Bible study for your people for over a year and a half. And now you're trying to say that I'm doing something immoral or unethical when I'm teaching when your people won't. Why is that important? It is important because as much as the progressives think they are, just because they raise a flag with a rainbow flag, or they talk about this politics over another politic, does not mean that they are comfortable and know what to do with Black and brown people in the midst, right? As long as and this is the part that is a struggle for most progressives. Progressives want to maintain their sense of superiority as long as they think that the people are useful to them. But if they have to see them as equals, is when the real struggle between whether or not somebody is going to be accepted as their own. I mean, even as a judge, man, you read my resume. You know those accomplishments that you saw in the resume. But I can tell you that I saw all kinds of individuals that had a hard time being my equal, right? Being the same judge, same amount of money, same prestige, because that's not something that they were accustomed to. Now, I was the only African-American serving in the judicial, as a judicial judge in Dane County for over 3.5 years, until the governor just appointed one of my good friends. But up until that point, it was hard for them. And these are progressive people. but they could not see that because in their subconscious mind, their superiority meant, you know, this is where we exist. This is our space. And when somebody young and Black comes into that space, then they didn't know how to respond to that. And that's been across the spectrum of individuals who have not been able to, been forced to examine or be uncomfortable with all of the messages that are automatically sent to them on a daily basis that they have not readily processed. And the uncomfortable conversation is just that, Peter. It is just saying to people, sit down and think about all of these messages that you get from back and forth all the time, that you're constantly being seen all the time. And that's what you have to sit with for a minute when you begin these conversations. And seeing George Floyd getting his, I mean, I don't know how many of you, you know, maybe y'all can put like a hand clap or something on your faces, but how many of you all just sat with your congregations and watched that video of the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that officer sat on George Floyd's neck? I mean, you don't have to be like a revolutionary. You could just say, you know, in our time, we're going to take this video and we're going to sit down for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and we're going to watch it together as a congregation. And we're going to sit in this 8 minutes and 46 seconds. How many pastors did that? Right? So it's not like you got to be out there doing, you know, Martin Luther King changing the whole world, Jim Wallace. It's just saying, what can I take from the culture and sit with my people with that information so that we are in this journey together, right? To the degree in which pastors haven't even done that. I mean, you leave all this space for people to fill in, well, what am I supposed to do with this? How do I process this? How do I understand this? And if you don't give them, you know, a way to be present in this moment, then they will fill it in with whatever society tells them is appropriate for them to do. Right?
You have already answered one of the other questions that had been sent in, and that had to do with any sense of particularity about how is Wisconsin, this territory, challenged in ways that other parts of the country may not be. And you spoke to that well in talking about Midwest NICE and the sort of challenge, the barrier that poses to getting into meaningful conversations. Another reference that you made early on was to the fact that one thing you've learned about Lutherans is that they tend to be open to reading something. You mentioned the book White Fragility. Someone else asked in the chat room, what are other top 5 books to recommend as congregational reads? If one of the ways to get congregational members to be reflecting on this is to ask them to read and discuss something. Mm-hmm. We've mentioned White Fragility. You've mentioned the documentary, The Power of an Illusion. Anything else that comes to your mind that might be helpful for our folks?
Yeah, I would say one book is, I think it's by Beverly Tatum, Why All the Black Children Eating Together, like in the lunchroom. I think a classic text is Michelle Alexander's book. I think her examination of the new Jim Crow is a powerful read to have a conversation with. Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. A new book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is another one that I think is really popular right now because it really does get at the core of what we want from our allies. And I'm trying to think of some good ones. Watching I like documentaries too, but watching a documentary by James Baldwin that says, I Am Not Your Negro, really lays out Baldwin's thought processes as he's thinking about being a Black American gay in being basically in France, but writing about the American context is also an important text that I think helps us understand it. I think Frantz Fanon in Wretched of the Earth, he gives a very nice way to talk about how culture impacts both those who are in it, but also the color of those who are in it and how it influences those individuals. So if I was having a conversation with any of those authors, those are the authors that I would be in conversation with to both help me both understand what is race, but also understand the systemic ways in which race impacts how people see different systems, educational, criminal, and even economic at the same time. There's some other books on housing that are important that I probably could pull up as well. I'm looking at my my library right now. I mean, there's so many good books that we could talk about.
You've given us a good start for
Yeah.
some summer reading and beyond. Are
Yeah.
you familiar with the book that was written by an African-American Lutheran ELCA pastor called Dear Church, Lenny Duncan?
No, I've never heard that one.
Okay, well, maybe I'll send you that and see what you think of that one. That's gotten moved around some circles in the ELCA.
Yeah, and you see all of these, other suggestions that Mary and Michael Lee put up there. I mean, these are also great books to, so when I say that you can engage this conversation, it's not like the materials are not out there.
Right.
It's just that we have to have the courage to use all of these different models to help, our congregational members get the tools and the lenses that they need to even engage in the conversation.
Sure.
So that they're just afraid sometimes to even engage because we haven't prepared them with the language to have that discussion.
Maybe I'll toss in a question that was a more theological question. I'll read it to you. Pondering the works of Black theologians such as James Cone and Willie James Jennings, what would you say are some of the main areas of white theology that we as pastors need to deconstruct and replace with the gospel in order to address racism?
So, when you mentioned James Cone, Black theology and Black power obviously are important texts for James Cone, but he wrote that last book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, which he really tried to, make, I think, the shift to say, okay, if we're going to talk about systemic racism, we have to see the lynchings as the cross as a lynching and lynching as a cross. And I think the theological perspective that many white folks have is this notion of avoiding conflict at all costs, right? That they see Jesus as a peacemaker rather than a conflict agitator, and they don't want to make the ultimate sacrifice that they will have to make sometimes in order to bring about what the kingdom looks like. So what Cone and William Jennings, William Jennings to a lesser degree, Cone more toward the later part of his life, he always talked about the risk of the gospel, the risk, and we talk about it, Bonhoeffer with cheap grace, and we talk about Martin Luther taking the risk to put those ideas on the door. I mean, these were individuals who took hard risk to make sure that the kingdom fulfilled its purpose. And there are a lot of pastors who are trained to avoid taking the risk, to avoid making the conflict. And sometimes in order to be a good pastor, you have to risk never being able to pastor, right? In order to lead people, you have to be able to go with them, to journey with them, and to show them that you're on that path together. Right, so it is an interesting conversation to see how pastors are both educated theologically to think about Jesus and the cross, how Jesus, was manifesting his ministry in trying to bring about conflict, not just for the sake of just being argumentative, but conflict because he wanted to say, what we are doing is not representative of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's just not representative of this just God. It's just not. And so we have made the house of prayer into a den of thieves. We've turned it into that, and that requires of us to make some changes, and we have to fight for those fundamental changes. And what do they look like? It looks like, intentionally engaging the tax collector. It means engaging individuals in their own community spaces and not expecting people to come to us. And if they do come to us, what are we going to do when they come to us? How are we going to respond? Are we going to focus on the sin, or are we going to focus on the ailment? And what are we going to do? And we have given ourselves permission to follow theologians that put us at a distance, rather than theologians who require us to be present in the moment for our suffering, for our pain, for our cause. And I think when James Cone wrote Malcolm, his book on Malcolm and Martin, that's what he talked about, was this desire to fulfill God's kingdom by being present in the moment. And that's what pastors have to understand at all times. We have to be pastors who are in the moment, but then the other part is that we have to be pastors. And I sometimes ask myself all the time, did God require us, to go after wolves in sheep's clothing? I know we're supposed to go after the lost sheep, but are we supposed to go after wolves in sheep's clothing? And I've come to accept that sometimes that God wants us to pay attention to the sheep and not always be aware, just be aware of the wolves. Bring the sheep back in. So that means that we have to be shepherds that are always trying to make sure that our people are correct, that our leadership models remind our people that we are here, that we are present, that we're trying our best to maintain what the kingdom is trying to be, and lift up the model of what Jesus is. I think Paul in the book of Ephesians talks about Jesus as the cornerstone that held together all the different pieces of what diverse and different people look like, but Jesus was the one that held it together as the cornerstone. And I think if pastors are honest with themselves, we are being called to be more cornerstone people than ever before. Because if we're going to really build a diverse kingdom and hold it together, then we have to be the ones who know how to hold different types of individuals together, which means that we have to be trained to be flexible and understanding, to be better listeners, to be better pastors in many regards. So I say that as a pastor who is pastoring a multicultural congregation full of all kinds of individuals, but that the risk that I had to take to be that kind of pastor meant that I had to confront a whole bunch of racism, homophobia, bigotry, all kinds of things, to become this kind of pastor that journeys with my people. And I've lost some who would rather hold on to hate than they would love. But in the end, we've created spaces where all people can be heard and accepted and be a part of that journey together. So I would say theologically, you just have to think about, risk. You have to think about leadership models, and you have to really be sensitive with the idea that in the end, we have to trust God to provide us with exactly what we need in the moments that we need it.
I'm hearing you articulate a balance or a posture for pastors to take. Well, let me just say it this way and see if this is getting at what you're saying. Occasionally, I will hear of a pastor who said, I know my congregation is not going to like this. I know they're conservative, but I'm going to get up and preach it, and they'll either call for my resignation or they'll leave the church or whatever. And we'll say that almost in a kind of a self-validifying sort of a way that see how much integrity I have because I haven't compromised this bold proclamation. On the other hand, you use language, and sometimes that speaks to the role we have in creating tension and moving people into uncomfortable conversations. On the other hand, you're also consistently using the language of journeying with your people. And early on, you made a reference to passing reference that I think is very significant. Maybe not from the pulpit. That's a position where it's only one directional. There can't be any back and forth in that setting. So it's away from that. I'm reminded of when some years back when I went to a training week for church-based community organizing. Mm-hmm. And one of the techniques that they used at the end of every meeting that they would hold in whatever action was being planned or strategy, they would always evaluate the effectiveness of the meeting. And one of the key questions was, where did you feel tension? Mm-hmm. And the idea was that if you sat through a whole meeting and there was never any tension any place, you really weren't bumping up against issues that warranted being bumped up against or making people uncomfortable or having to question the assumptions they came into the meeting with. I think what I'm hearing you say is a marvelous balance between a conviction that there are these uncomfortable issues that we have got to address if we're going to be true to the gospel, but we don't do it by being dismissive of the people that we're journeying with. We journey with them.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm glad you brought that point so I can clarify. I promise you we have a model that, you get up in the pulpit, it's burning on your heart and you got to just say it. You got to just say it. And that may be true, but the reality is that, Jesus spent a whole bunch of time sitting on mountaintops talking to people. right? He spent a whole bunch of time in homes of tax collectors talking to people, right? He spent a lot less time preaching and more time teaching and journeying with people. So if we're intentional, we always know these issues are going to come up. So the question is, what are you doing when there is no tension? What are you doing when there are no issues? And what are seeds are you planting inside the minds of the congregation when there aren't just tense moments to work on, so that you can always be building that momentum toward places of getting them to be, you know, the kind of people who can have these conversations. When I decided to become a pastor, a Black pastor who, you know, was going to be open and affirming, it was the probably the most seminal decision that I had made, because I could not accept that we were, you know, talking about justice, but if you were gay and lesbian, you couldn't be a member of our church, and you couldn't be accepted, and we couldn't use your gifts, and we would let preachers come in and they would preach all kind of bad sermons and nasty sermons about people. And I said to myself, that is no longer acceptable. I cannot do this. And before I decided to marry a same-sex couple, I was preaching and teaching about openness and inclusiveness and love and joy. So by the time I announced that, you know, and I didn't even know I had a same-sex couple in my congregation that was going to step out and say they wanted to be married. But they were listening to everything I was saying about inclusiveness and support and love and creating a community, you know, talking with my elder members about what their thoughts were, how did they feel, what were their experiences. And so when this couple came up, I was like, you know, I'm going to do this. And I promise you, I thought it was going to be a revolution of people just saying, oh, I'm done with this. This is crazy. You know, but what I found was at least people were saying, okay, well, I don't quite agree, but at least he's right about love. So maybe he's been talking about love for the last 2 years. So maybe that makes sense. Let me just hold on. Let me just see what he's talking about love. You know, I did that, you know, almost 5 years ago, and you would have thought that the wheels were going to fall off, the church was going to close down, people going to leave, and, you know, and the converse, they thought it was just going to be like an overwhelming of LGBTQ plus people coming into our churches. None of that happened. What we realized was that I had to give them time to be able to understand how to process this stuff, while at the same time helping them understand why it's important that hate not dominate God's house. And that took a moment, but I can tell you now that, you know, people come and they are so happy and peaceful and they're safe. So you're not going to resolve conflict, but what they have to know is that they are safe to have the conversation, and that nobody will be demonized, nobody will be, you know, put down, disrespected, that everybody will be brought into the space of love at the same time. And that is what makes the shift of true leadership to me. And I made some mistakes along the way, but for the most part, I tried to apologize to and be honest that I just knew this was right. I didn't have a roadmap to get there, and I'm sorry if I did it the wrong way. But there's no roadmap. There's only, you know, making sure that we love all of God's children, and that's where we have to start at the beginning, and everything else as we can figure out as we go along. But we have to start there. So yes, it took great risk, right, to use that moment. But I learned from that journeying with people and listening to their concerns, helping them understand where I'm coming from. I understand where they're coming from. I didn't ask them for their permission, because I knew if I would ask them for their permission, they probably would have said no. But I did ask them for their forgiveness, because I knew that this is where God requires all of us to be. And I think more pastors may have to start asking for forgiveness. But if you keep asking for permission, you're going to always be sidelined based on where you have prepared the people to be. If you have not prepared the people to be able to accept it and understand it, or have the lenses to see it, then be willing to accept the fact that they will not be willing to move with
you. We're getting close to the end of our time. I'm looking at the chat room. There's a host of, I'm glad this is recorded so people can go back to it, because there's a host of good reading suggestions and resource suggestions that have been posted in that.
Hey, Peter, can I get to that last question though? I know we're at the end. I want to get to that rural conversation, because I saw somebody put it in there, and that's why I I want to make
Okay,
sure I get that.
go
That's
ahead.
why I'm talking not just about reading. I'm talking about documentaries too. So it's not just about reading. It is the use of video and other media means now that we didn't have access to, say 5 or 7 years ago. We can summarize books. Books can be summarized. Let the people who read. But if you're in communities where that can sometimes be a barrier, I'll tell you that I struggled with illiteracy all the years because I had so much trauma that I was functionally illiterate all the way through college. And so I struggle with reading. And so reading is not my forte. It still takes me time to grind through some stuff. But if you put a documentary in front of my face, I can analyze a documentary and the visuals and the scenes, and I can be just as conversant about that as I can books. I think putting those two things together, those who can read, let them read. But those who like media, let them watch it. And then have them come back and we can have a conversation about both pieces at the same time. Summarize them in cliff notes, and then let the ones who watch it. And then that's where I think you can bring both communities together. So don't let that be an impediment to conversation. At this point, hell, I think churches ought to have their own Netflix accounts. I think, you know what I'm saying? You can't just be asking members that. The church need to have your own Netflix account so that when you come into service, y'all can pull your own Netflix and hotspots and stream. If y'all don't have broadband services, you need to be pushing at your state legislatures to be like, listen, my broadband service is not good enough for my people to be able to listen to these conversations, and we need to start right there because I can't build justice without the proper, all those things can build toward greater advocacy. But you got to make sure that the people have a diverse ways in which to engage this information. Bringing in speakers, like me or other people, just to talk to, just have a conversation, sit down, pop, y'all are Lutherans. So, maybe over some lutefisk or lutefisk dinners or some beer, something where we can sit down, break bread and just talk. And the more we talk, the more people will begin to see that relationship and be willing to take that risk that their pastor is going to ask them to take at the end of this conversation.
Marvelous. I see we are at time. At the risk of running a minute or two over, I want to do this. Virtually all of our conversation has been around in our context of church leadership dealing with the people in our congregations in this part of the country. There was one question posted that I'll see if you want to say anything about. And we could be off and running, I suppose, but at least to give you a shot at it, and that is how has national leadership over the past 3 years made conversations around race, I suppose you could even throw in coronavirus, more difficult, or how has it impacted how we go about trying to have these conversations?
See, I think people think that Trump and his dog whistle stuff is what is making conversations difficult. What has made the conversations difficult is the inability to what he has given people permission to do is to stop thinking that there is a narrative that is, how do I say this without, that there's a narrative that they are losing something, right? That they are losing their culture, that they're losing their America, right? It is very much a dog whistle to that idea. And because they are being taught that they are losing it, they're coming back up to defend what it is that they have been programmed to believe is their culture, right? So, but that is what makes it difficult, is because when you're trying to have conversations with even progressives, they will go to an extent until they get to the point where they say, okay, now we are losing something, right? And man, that makes it so hard, because once they think they're losing something, they rise up to defend it. And what many of us have tried to say is that the reason why this moment is different, and if y'all not paying attention, you're gonna miss it. The revolution is here, is because there has been a generation that watched 8 years of Black competence in Obama, and they were raised watching that. And so the idea that now Black people are inferior doesn't make any sense to them, because the president, the highest office of our land, was a black man with a real black woman with some black children. And that doesn't reek of inferiority. It reeks of equality at best. So they don't understand this narrative of trying to recapture this idea of white superiority over against black inferiority. It doesn't make any sense to them. And so now when they see a situation with George Floyd, when the coronavirus has literally stopped everything, there are no distractions. Nobody is distracted. They are seeing this on screens because there's no movies to go to. There's no baseball games, no football games, no basketball games. There's nothing but to watch that 8 minutes and 46 seconds, which some of you haven't done yet with your congregations. But those young people did. And when they sat there and they watched that 8 minutes and 46 seconds, it changed their perception about what is superior and what is inferior. And when that shift happened, all of what you see across this nation, across this world, has been a reflection of that anger and that frustration. If y'all as pastors haven't sat down and done that, then you won't quite understand why the rest of this world has lost has found their compass. And when we find that compass again, I promise you, man, y'all won't have no more issues with that. You know, you won't have any more issues trying to get people to move, to read, to study, because they're going to keep asking themselves a question: how in the hell did we get to this place where we get to watch on TV a black man being lynched? And I thought that was something they only did in the South, but somebody in a police uniform did it in progressive Minneapolis, Minnesota. That, my friend, is the narrative that will shift the conversation. I don't care nothing about Trump. Trump he's a representative of all kinds of people who have co-signed a behavior, from whether you're talking about racism or the fact that he won't even put on the mask just so we know we can keep people safe. It is just a reflection of where our nation is, and it's going to be up to us to make sure that whoever is in, regardless of what political persuasion you're in, that you are working hard to create balance so that all people have access to whatever it is we call the American dream, right? The American dream.
I think that we are at time, and that's probably, and I appreciate that as a note to end on, in that you're describing a kind of a wake-up moment that we're in right now. The confluence of the virus giving us a moment of singular attention on the George Floyd incident, and that becoming a kind of a wake-up call that thrusts us into deeper conversations. You have been all and more than I anticipated in this conversation. Everett Mitchell, you are a gift to not only your people, but you're a gift to this society and the whole body of Christ that you're a part of. Certainly this past hour, you've been a gift to us as well. So I thank you for your time, your willingness to do this. We'll have to figure out how our paths cross again, because this has been very rich and appreciated by me, and I know by many.
Yeah, I'm a friend of Lutherans, man. I love Lutherans, man. So
that's a good thing, because in Wisconsin you're surrounded by a whole lot of them. So that's a very good thing.
And let me say this last thing, Peter.
Sure.
I am so diehard committed to this idea of racial justice. I took my congregation and co-located with Lake Edge United Church of Christ down the street. And we're in the same building, working on issues of social justice together. Because, we can talk all day about Sunday morning being the most segregated hour, but we have to make some intentional commitment somewhere. And it's not easy. And man, I can tell you, boy, the tension is always there, but at least we are committed together to trying to figure out how to best create a world for our children in the future. So I love you all. Thank you all so much for your time. I appreciate being here with y'all.
Thank you for being with us. Vicki, any closing announcements or comments? Next week, we'll be back at our regular Tuesday time.
Right.
What else?
Yes, we will. Yep, that's exactly what I was going to say. So next week, again, at 2:00. Thank you again, Bishop and Reverend Mitchell, for joining us. And thanks, everyone, for being here for another Equipping the Saints webinar today. It's always better with you here. Go in peace as you go about the rest of your day.
Thank you all.